So good afternoon, everyone. Before we begin today's event, even though you might be joining us for different parts of the country, on behalf of our host, Macquarie University, I would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the Macquarie University land, the Wallumedegal clan of the Darug Nation, whose cultures and customs have nurtured and continue to nurture this land since the Dreamtime. As we share our own knowledge, teaching, learning and research practices on this land, may we also pay respects to elders past, present and future. Hello everyone and welcome to our annual Mental Health Month public lecture and happy International Day for Older Persons. My name is Jasmine Chen. I'm a postdoctoral researcher and clinical psychologist in the Centre for Emotional Health and the Centre for Aging, Cognition and Wellbeing here at Macquarie University. This is the 11th year of our Mental Health Month public lecture, and this event is supported by the Centre for Emotional Health and the Centre for Aging, Cognition and Wellbeing. Last year was the first time we held the public lecture virtually because of the pandemic. I was so confident that we will be back to hosting this year's public lecture in person, but here we are. And hey, it means that more people can join in from all around the country. And I think we even have an international audience joining today. So it is my pleasure to introduce our speaker today, Professor Viviana Wuthrich. Viviana is a professor of clinical psychology in the School of Psychological Sciences here at Macquarie University. She is director at the Centre for Aging, Cognition and Wellbeing, and the current national convener of the Psychology and Aging Interest Group of the Australian Psychological Society. Viv's research broadly focuses on mental health and wellbeing across the lifespan, with a particular interest in how the underlying mechanisms, symptoms, and causes of anxiety and low mood change in later life. She has a particular interest in evaluating psychological interventions to treat anxiety and low mood in older adults, and developing prevention programs to reduce risk for dementia. She developed Aging Wisely, which is a psychological intervention program for treating low mood and anxiety in older adults. This program is used in public and private mental health settings. In this lecture, Viv is going to discuss the research on mental health and social connections in older adults, and she will share with you the latest findings on the impact of the pandemic on older adults' mental health. The findings might surprise you. And Viv will also be talking about the importance of social connections, barriers to maintaining connections, and the impact of online connections on wellbeing. During the lecture, we welcome you to pop through your questions to us. You can do these by typing your questions in the chat function of this Zoom meeting. Following the lecture, we will be having a brief Q&A session, and I will do my best to get Viv to answer as many questions as possible. Now, just note that this webinar will be recorded and made available to everyone registered. We have had an overwhelming response with registration for this lecture. So what we will do is we will also be live streaming this online lecture through our CEH Facebook page. All right, that is all from me now. And without further ado, I'm going to hand this over to Viv.
Thank you, Jasmine, and a big thank you to Nicole, who is behind the scenes and has been helping to set this up for us. So welcome again to our public lecture. And as Jasmine said, I too was very confident that we would be meeting again face to face, but here we are with the ongoing pandemic. So I wanted to talk to you this year a bit more about social connections. This was part of the topic we had last year, but this year now, over a year into the pandemic, we can really have a look at the impact of social connections on mental health in older adults, and in particular, what the impact of online social connections has been. So first of all, as Jessamine said, I do want to acknowledge that this public lecture is being co-hosted by both the Centre for Emotional Health, which is a university centre of research excellence here at Macquarie University. It's focused on understanding and treating mental disorders right across the lifespan. And so at the end of the presentation, I'll have some information for you about where you can access information about that particular centre. And also the Centre for Ageing, Cognition and Wellbeing, which is a centre specifically dedicated to ageing. It is a multidisciplinary centre in the faculty. You can see the respective websites for more information. And of course today, as you know, is International Day of the Older Person, which is a World Health Organization initiative, and it is the first day of Mental Health Month, being October. And so I think it's the best day of the year to talk about older adult mental health. So this year we're going to focus on social connections and mental health. And so to start, I just want to talk a little bit about what do we know about the role of social connections in mental health in general in older people. And a little bit of this content will be similar to what we covered last year, but I just need to sort of set the stage, I guess, for what's going to come after that. So what do we know? Well, it turns out, perhaps a bit of common sense, but poor social connections are associated with poor mental health, all right? And in fact, poor social connections are associated with a whole range of negative consequences for older people. So it's actually directly related to poorer physical health as well as poorer mental health. We also know it's associated with increased risk of suicidal ideation. We know it increases the risk for loneliness, increases the risk for decreased quality of life, and perhaps really interestingly, it also increases the risk of premature death. Now, we don't exactly know what are the mechanisms that underlie these particular connections, but there is some evidence that's suggesting that by having poorer social connections, increases the risk for loneliness, increases the sense that you have low social support. And those things in turn seem to be associated with higher cortisol levels, which is a stress hormone, increased levels of inflammation, and a lower immune functioning. And so it's thought that these things together contribute to the increased risk of death, as well as the poorer physical health and all of those other associated factors. So we know that maintaining good social connections is actually then really important for mental health. So of course you won't be surprised then that the research has exactly found that, which shows that for older adults, the more they engage in social activities, so the more they attend religious groups, social groups, community groups, the better their mental health, the better their physical health. And we also know that participating widely in social groups is associated with reduced cognitive decline. In addition to that, we also know that volunteering has been associated with better perceived health and well-being, as well as greater life satisfaction. And this too, so volunteering by itself is also associated with reduced mortality, reduced depression, and reduced use of healthcare services. So lots of reasons why it's important for older people to maintain good social connections and social participation. Now, interestingly, the Harvard study of adult development, which has tracked people actually for about 50 years across their life and looked at a whole range of factors. And what they have discovered is that to be the thing that predicts being happier and healthier at the age of 80, the one thing that they found predicts that is having stronger connections to family, friends, and community at age 50. So that's interesting. We don't exactly know why, but I think some clues come from other research that tells us that we know that over the lifespan, and as you become an older adult and later through the later life, your social network will naturally decline. People move away. Yes, some people die. Lots of reasons why social networks shrink as people get older. So I think perhaps what this research is telling us is that if you start off with a larger social network, there's going to be more people left as your social network decreases over time. But the important thing, and the message I really want to make sure you understand here, is that it doesn't mean that social networks can't be formed or created later in life. So just because someone doesn't have a great social network at 50 or 60 or 70 does not mean that those things cannot be enhanced. So I think it's important to really classify what are the types of social participation that are actually really meaningful. So it's not just any type of social participation that is associated with better mental health. So what we know is it is partly about frequency, right? So the more social contact, the better. But actually the thing that is the fundamental factor is actually the quality of that social connections. That's what's more important than the quantity. So in fact, we also know that engaging with social groups, so multiple people in one setting, is actually much better for mental health than having high quality individual relationships. So it's not about the one-on-one relationships, it's actually about the group setting that's important. So that means catching up with groups of friends. It means being involved in a local community group or a sporting group or involved in a local club. And we're not exactly sure why, but what it seems to be is that when you're part of a social group, it increases your sense of social identity. You actually build an identity with the other group members. And it seems to give you a better sense that you have a wide range of social support available to you. In addition, it's quite likely by engaging in social groups, you actually have more mental stimulation from participating with more people. And that in itself is actually protective, not only for mental health issues, but also for cognitive decline. Now, research has shown that the more social groups an individual participates in, the better their mental health. This is particularly true as people get older. The research shows that the effects of participating in social groups has a moderate effect at around the age of 50 on mental health, but a very profound effect by the age of 80. Some really interesting research related to participation in social groups is that social group participation reduces risk for dementia, such that the more social groups an 8-year-old participates in, it decreases their cognitive decline by 9.5 years. So that means as an 8-year-old, if you're engaged in multiple social groups, your cognitive ability is more likely to be that of a 70-year-old. Now, I think that's an incredibly profound effect. So we want to have lots of social participation. We want it to be high quality, but we particularly want to make sure that we're involved in a number of different social groups. All right, so given that we've just been through almost 2 years of a global pandemic in which older people in particular have been told to stay in their homes, to not have face-to-face contact for fear of people contracting the virus, what has been the impact of this on the mental health of older people? You might expect that older people, being the most vulnerable in terms of the health consequences of the virus, would therefore be the most affected from a mental health point of view by all of this isolation. It is certainly true that older people have experienced increases in anxiety and depression and loneliness, but so has the rest of the population as well. But when we actually have a look at how older people have fared compared to other age groups, the findings are actually pretty interesting. So the research actually consistently shows that older people have coped better from a mental health point of view than younger people have with the pandemic. So some of the earliest research came right, the beginning, I guess, of the pandemic, around March, I guess, when the virus had spread and we were starting to see major lockdowns and restrictions taking place. So the first sample was a sample that was studied in March 2020. And what this particular study found, so they had 945 people, all adults, so over the age of 18 up to the age of 76, they found that the older adults had better emotional well-being than the younger adults. This was replicated in an independent study of more than 5,000 adults in June. They found the same thing. They found that older adults had, in fact, lower rates of mental disorders at the time than younger adults. Now, just remember, when in the first phase of this virus, older people were the most vulnerable. And so you would expect that they should be the most fearful and those who are most concerned about their health and those who are feeling the effects of the isolation the most. We have similar findings in Spain and similar findings in Canadian samples, as well as a whole host of other samples around the world. These are just some of the larger samples that have been demonstrated. So that last study, the one in US and Canadian sample, what they did in that study is they actually had younger and older people, or in fact anyone over the age of 18, track their mood every day of the week for a couple of weeks. And what they found is that older people had less negative mood on a day-to-day basis, and they had more positive mood on a day-to-day basis than the younger adults. Now, that's a comparison between younger and older people, but what does it mean for older people themselves? Did they themselves experience significantly more anxiety and depression and changes in loneliness during this period of pandemic? So a large study in the Netherlands is a longitudinal study that's been running for many, many, many years. And so they have really good data on mental health of people before the pandemic, and they were able to then sample this population also through the pandemic. And that enabled them to make some comparisons about how people's symptoms had changed pre and post pandemic. What they found in this large sample was that although senses of loneliness increased, which is probably no doubt related to the social isolation, mental health levels remained unchanged in the older sample. So although people were feeling more isolated, they were able to manage those feelings and to deal with the consequences of that much better than the young people were. Now, similarly, in a small study here in Sydney, and this is a study run by my colleague, Dr. Carly Jonko, who you can see there in the picture, we actually recontacted older adults who previously had an anxiety disorder or a mood disorder and had been treated in our clinic here at Macquarie University 3 to 5 years previously. So we actually knew these people had mental health problems, and I guess our hypothesis was that of all the people who would be struggling the most, it would probably be those people. Right? Much more chance you would relapse and have significant anxiety and depression if you're someone who had experienced those problems previously. We found no significant changes in levels of anxiety and depression or distress from when they left treatment, our last contact they'd had with us, where they had been, say, recovered generally, to in the middle of the pandemic. So that was interesting. That actually meant that these people had maintained the positive benefits that they had experienced after treatment. And in fact, the overall relapse rates across the whole sample were much lower than we expect. So 7 to 17%, depending on whether we were looking at anxiety or depression, despite this 5-year follow-up. So again, this, I think, really just adds to this evidence that older people have been able to sustain this pandemic really quite well. So I'm not saying it's a positive thing and it's been, fun, but rather older people have been able to take it in their stride and adapt to the challenges that are being presented. So why are these older people more resilient? I mean, how is this the case? Now, for some of you who have been involved in the research that we do in the centre, you will know I've been looking at this for quite a number of years now. And so there's a whole range of reasons why we think older people actually were more resilient through the pandemic. And in fact, it's true that older people generally are more resilient outside of a pandemic. The research is really showing us that older people have better emotion regulation skills. So what that means is that when older people are faced with a stressor or a negative event, they typically are better able to manage than younger people are. And part of the reason is that they are better able at accepting what's going on rather than spending lots of time trying to control it. They are able to accept it, work out what it is that they can change and get on with it, or otherwise just how it is that they're going to cope with whatever is going on for them. So this real ability to just adapt to stressful situations. We know overall older adults do report consistently less negative emotion on a day-to-day level, and they do consistently report the experience of more positive emotions on a day-to-day level compared to younger adults. So I guess during a pandemic, and we saw that in one of the studies, it makes sense that older people are still going to use those same emotion regulation techniques to managing the latest stressor. We know that older adults actually report more life satisfaction. So something about older adults' ability to appreciate, I guess, what they've got and be grateful, I guess, for what they've got, and just being more satisfied with those things that they are able to do and they are able to achieve. There's definitely a suite of evidence that has developed that demonstrates that as people get older, there do tend to be more of a focus on positive experiences and positive situations in their life. So older adults, when presented with ambiguous sorts of stimuli, tend to interpret that stimuli in more positive ways. And thank you to those of you who have participated in research projects which have helped us to demonstrate this particular effect. And finally, it seems that life experience really does have a part to play in this. And I think this is because older adults have the ability to reflect on the things that they have coped with in the past and draw on those coping skills that they know work best for them. And I think when going through the pandemic, a lot of older people had many other situations that they could look back on and remember had been really tough for them, and that whilst the pandemic was tough, perhaps it wasn't as tough for those other situations, or perhaps it was as tough, but because they knew they had got through tough stuff in the past, then that really helps to build resilience and acceptance for situations. Now, of course, not everyone did well and has been doing well through the pandemic, all right? So some older adults too, of course, have struggled with increases in anxiety and depression and loneliness. So in another study by a colleague of mine, this is Dr. Paul Strutt, we actually examined what factors were protective in older adults. What is it that made some older adults cope with the pandemic and the lockdowns better than others? This was in a sample of 201 older adults, aged 60 to 87 years old. And what we found here is that better mental health during the pandemic was associated with living with someone else, so not living alone, which is pretty common sense, I think. We found that those older adults who took up new technology with the point of trying to socialise with that technology actually fared better. So in fact, this was one of the first studies that we conducted that found that about 60% of older adults during the pandemic started using technology they hadn't used before. And a lot of that technology was related to video conferencing software. So things like, so they could FaceTime or do Zoom calls, for instance, or other sort of video conferencing apps or features or formats. And we found that that seemed to be really associated with better mental health and being able to endure the pandemic better than others. Now, interestingly, we were the first study in the world to actually look at the impact of maintaining contact with grandchildren during the pandemic, and we found a very interesting finding there. We found that for those older adults who were able to maintain contact with their grandchildren, whether it be just over the telephone or whether it was using some sort of video conferencing, actually reported significantly better mental health. So as we were talking about before earlier in the presentation, not all social contact is equal, and it seems that grandchildren play a particularly important part of maintaining mental health, perhaps for older people. And we also found that older people who fared better during the pandemic were those older people who spent less time ruminating. So less time dwelling on negative things and letting those negative thoughts rattle round and round in their head. The ones who were able to move on and be productive and get on with things and adapt to the situation certainly did better in terms of managing the pandemic. So we've talked about, why social connections are important, and we've talked about the fact that in our studies we've found that older adults readily picked up new technology in order to be able to maintain social contact through online forums. But we were really interested in understanding whether online social contact is as good as face-to-face contact. I mean, is this the new way that we might socialise? Is this what we might expect older people to do in the future, is to try and manage more contact online? And so we actually just recently conducted a study where we were looking at the differences between older people who adapted the social groups that they were participating in to an online format, those who dropped out of those groups, and those who maintained contact but in a face-to-face format, using masks and social distancing requirements. So this particular study was led by our moderator today, who you just met before, Dr. Jessamine Chen. And so in this particular study, we surveyed 126 older adults aged 60 to 90 years. And what we looked at were 8 different social groups that people readily engage in. So sporting groups, religious groups, hobby groups, cultural groups, volunteering, meal entertainment, so getting together with other people for meals, community groups, and we also had an other social group category as well. And what we did in a survey is we asked people to rate how often they engage in these sorts of activities on a regular basis before the pandemic, and how often they were engaging in those particular groups now. We also asked people to rate how satisfying those groups were before the pandemic and how satisfying they were now. And we also asked how connected they felt to the other members of that group before the pandemic and now. So we are particularly interested in whether changes to online formats might change people's satisfaction with these groups and, importantly, change their sense of connection that they had to the members in the group. We also examined, of course, changes in mental health and quality of life as well. Now, in this study too, we found there was a large uptake of new technology that was reported by the sample. This time, 74% of the participants saying that they had started using new technology during the pandemic with the purpose of maintaining social contact. And so once again, this uptake of new technologies tended to be in the format of video conferencing or other ways where they could see other individuals in their group. Now, as you would imagine and as you would have experienced, many of these groups had periods of shutdown before some of them went online, some did not. But in our study, we found that most of these group activities were moved to online formats. Not all of them. Some it was much more difficult. Things like cultural activities, for instance, was not always possible to move to an online format. Some sporting groups obviously had difficulty, like it's hard to put a team sport online, for instance. And some groups just found the online format didn't work particularly well. So, for example, choirs in some instances were not very well received when they moved to an online format. But by and large, most groups did offer some type of online format, or they offered a face-to-face format which complied with the relevant physical distancing, masks, and then the other sorts of rules around face-to-face gatherings. Overall, Jessamine found that about 30% drop out across all activities, where people were not necessarily dropping out of all activities, but at least dropping one of their previously regular activities. And the most common drops were in the cultural activities. The least common dropout was in the meal entertainment. So it seems that by and large, people prioritised being able to catch up with somebody else for a meal as the main way they wanted to socialise. And whether that be online, or you might remember that last year, during periods of the pandemic, people were allowed to gather in small groups for meals in certain settings and under certain rules. So what did we find in terms of how much people's satisfaction and connectedness with the groups and their mental health change as a result of this change to online formats? So I know this is a bit of a difficult slide to process, so I'll just talk you through the key points. Again, quite difficult to see, but there is this sort of the solid circle here. These represent people who dropped out of these activities. And of course, not surprisingly, right across all the different activities, we found that they had a significant decrease in their satisfaction and also their sense of connectedness, which is not shown on this slide, but looks very, very similar. So I won't show that slide, but very similar pattern of results. All right, so we know that definitely dropping out of activities was not good. And in fact, we found that for those people that did drop out of activities, they had, even just dropping out of one activity, had implications for their overall quality of life, as well as their mental health. during the pandemic. So again, I think this really emphasises the research I was talking about before, that it's not just about having some social participation. The more social participation, the better, and the more social groups, the better. So if you only have 2 or 3 groups and suddenly you drop out of one, that actually can take a really big impact on your mental health. We also found, though, that overall, for all the groups, there was this general sense of decreased satisfaction and connectedness. Partly that might be just the effect of the pandemic itself, but partly perhaps because even when you're able to participate in an activity in a face-to-face format, the requirement to wear masks, to be socially distanced, to have less people perhaps in your group due to the number of people allowed in certain spaces, all those things seem to have taken at least some toll on people's satisfaction and sense of connectedness. But what you might also be able to see, and this is represented by the squares here. So the triangles were those who stayed participating in a face-to-face format, but obviously with the COVID safe practices in place. And the squares here represent those groups that moved to an online format. So we could see here for sporting, for instance, when people had to move to an online format, there was less satisfaction associated with the sporting activity. There was also less connectedness to that sporting activity in the online environment. And you can really see the same pattern of results, meaning that the online contact and doing these social groups online is definitely beneficial for mental health. And we saw that it was definitely protective for mental health and associated with better quality of life than people who dropped out of groups, but wasn't actually as good as the face-to-face contact. Even though the face-to-face contact involved masks and social distancing, the online contact was just not quite as good. And as part of this study, we also got some qualitative reports from people, and I think you probably all felt very similar to this. It's just that people felt there was just a bit of a disconnect. It was a bit harder to share information. Certainly in some groups, it was hard to, appreciate someone else's handiwork or craft when you were trying to do it via Zoom and trying to share a screen. People talk about the lack of physical contact being something that was a real barrier with the online formats rather, not being able to, hug your friends in particular. And as I mentioned before, certainly in some activities like in sports, for instance, and things like choirs and bands, the sense of the experience of participating online was just not the same. So again, I don't think it's in some ways not really surprising, but this is the only study that's actually looked at this. So I guess it's interesting in that way. So if we think about what this has been showing us together, some of the take-home messages, I guess, of what we've been talking about today. So firstly, we know that older adults throughout this pandemic have actually demonstrated more emotional resilience than younger people. And again, this is not really that surprising to, I guess, to researchers like myself who study the emotional resilience of older people in general, but perhaps is really surprising to the general public who might have thought that older people would have struggled the most. So in fact, it seems like, yes, again, the resilience of older age has actually demonstrated benefits in the wake of a pandemic. Now, I should say that all the research around this resilience was only conducted in that sort of first year. They were the large studies. And so what we don't really know what the impact has been on mental health of this enduring pandemic. And it is a little bit hard to tease apart because, of course, different countries have gone through different periods of lockdowns on and off, which makes that a little bit difficult to tease apart. But I think the message is relatively clear that overall, older people have really fared better from an emotional health point of view than younger people have. What we also could see is that older people have very readily picked up the use of technology, and this is really across all settings and all different age groups. People over the age of 80, we've seen people in residential aged care facilities pick up technology, and that technology uptake has been associated with increased social contact, and that increased social contact has then also been associated with improved mental health and wellbeing and reduced levels of loneliness. We've also found that whilst online contact is very beneficial and we should absolutely be using it for social contact, it is not as good as face-to-face. And so I think as different countries, and certainly here in New South Wales, we'll be starting to move out of some of the restrictions. I think it's important that everybody, but in particular older people, get back to engaging face-to-face as soon as practical and as soon as possible, because it seems like the benefits of face-to-face contact are definitely more significant than the benefits of online contact. And finally, of course, the message is the same message I gave you last year, which is it's really important to engage in social groups. Different social groups, a variety of social groups, and the more social groups, the better. Now, remembering that by engaging in more social groups, there is that sense of more social support, I believe more social stimulation and mental stimulation, which we know reduces the impact of cognitive decline. Remember that study I told you about that showed that at the age of 80, every group is associated with reductions in cognitive decline. So I think try and join a variety of different social groups. Now, I know that sounds like a really easy thing to say, but I also acknowledge that for some people, if you have lost contact with other people, or you're not engaged in many social groups, or you're a little bit shy and unsure about how to do that, it can feel like quite a difficult task to go and join some social groups. And so I guess I wanted to just mention a couple of little things about some hints about how you might do that. So it's going to take a bit of effort. It's going to take some motivation, a bit of a push in order to be able to facilitate this. But certainly you can start by just contacting people you haven't seen for a long time. So even just picking up the phone, calling friends you haven't spoken to for a long time. Be active about talking to your neighbours and talking to people in your community, right? So the more you talk and have those incidental conversations over time, that strengthens those relationships. And it means you can start to have conversations about, oh, what sort of social activities do you do? You know, maybe one day you'll be able to go along with them to one of the groups that they participate in as well. You can find out about new social activities in your local area. You can talk to your GP. You can look in a local paper or on local internet sites. Lots of social groups advertise their group in libraries or in notice boards, in the local paper and on radio. You can also ask your neighbours what sort of groups they go to, or your friends what groups they go to as well. And of course, you can also search the internet. So you'll actually find there's a lot of social groups out there for older people. You just have to actually make a bit of an effort to find them and then to call up and find out how it is that you join in. If I didn't mention already, a lot of local councils already have this listed as resources on their council website. And if not, if you call councils, I'm sure they can direct you to a number of different groups. In the beginning, it can be a little bit hard to join a new group, particularly if you don't know others. So just give it a go, give it some time. It takes a little bit of time to develop relationships and to build that connection with others. But definitely get out there and join as many social groups as you can, particularly as restrictions are lifting and face-to-face options are more available. All right, so it wouldn't be right to talk about older adult mental health on Mental Health Month and on the International Day of the Older Person without acknowledging where you might go if things aren't going so well for you. So the simplest ways that you can get some help if you're experiencing anxiety and depression, or if you're struggling with loneliness, you can talk to your GP, right? The GP will be able to provide you with a whole range of different options for where you can get help. You can call the mental health line. I've given you the number there. It's a 24-hour line. This is not a crisis line. Rather, it's a line that can help you to engage with services for mental health treatment if needed. There are lots of self-help resources available, so you can check out the Beyond Blue website as one option, but certainly just a general internet search will find a whole heap of tips about what you can do. And if you're interested in joining social groups, as I've mentioned before, you can contact your local council for some ideas. There are, of course, some studies that we're running at Macquarie University, and while some of these were initially run as face-to-face interventions, due to the pandemic, we too have also gone online. And so this is the SPAR study, which is a particular study funded by the NHMRC and Beyond Blue. And we are there examining the impact of social connections on mental health, so very relevant to today's topic. So we are still seeking participants. So if you are someone or know of someone over the age of 65 who struggles with anxiety or low mood, you can get some information there and contact us so we can help you out. And we have a second study also funded by the NHMRC and Beyond Blue. And this is very much a nationwide study where we're working with 6 different sites across New South Wales. But again, that provides interventions for older people who might be experiencing anxiety or low mood. So you can contact us again. It's the same phone number and the email is answered by the same research assistant. So it doesn't really matter which one you choose to use. We will be able to direct you to the right space. Now, if you're interested at all engaging with our research, so those studies that I talked about today, a lot of those, that research was based on the participants from our older adult research database. I know there will be some of you listening today. I know there's some of you who have listened probably to all 11 public lectures that I have given, and I really appreciate your help and thank you for everything that you do for us. The students definitely benefit from your participation, and as you can see, we also, I think, do some pretty valuable research at times as well. So if you're interested, there's information here about how you can sign up. Basically, the process will be we will email you or send you information about relevant studies, and you pick and choose the ones that you want to engage in as you like. We have some newsletters for both of the centres. The Centre for Emotional Health and the Centre for Ageing, Cognition and Wellbeing have newsletters where we report some of our research findings, but also upcoming events like this. So if you're interested, there's the information about how to join the newsletters. And finally, yes, this is me. And if you want to send me an email, by all means do so. There's my email address. Good, so I'm going to stop sharing my screen because we're going to send these or make these available on the website, so you'll be able to get any of this information as needed if you've missed any of that. Good, so I guess Jessamyn's going to help me with some questions.
Great. Thanks, Viv. That was really wonderful to hear. It's nice to see, this nice summary of some of the research that we have been doing during the pandemic. And it's really lovely to see, some of these results, coming together. And so I guess, some of the key messages that you pointed out, again, it's lovely to see that, older people have just been, really the ones who have been coping really well during this time. They've just got so many, all these resilience skills that just help them making the transition. So I've got a few questions coming from the audience. So perhaps I might start with a question from Mark. So Mark's question was, how much work has been done with regard to those living in residential aged care facilities, especially where dementia and cognitive decline may be a major factor?
Yeah, so yes, it's true. A lot of my research is actually in community dwelling older adults rather than residential aged care facility, but we have been involved in a little bit of work in this area. And the first thing to say is it's been incredibly difficult to monitor changes in people living in residential aged care facilities because of the lockdowns. So in fact, researchers haven't been able to access those services at all. But we did actually conduct a study with a very large study where we actually interviewed the managers and the care providers of people, such staff in residential aged care facilities, and asked them for their opinions about how they thought residents were coping. And as you might expect, there was really some mixed information there. A lot of the staff suggested that older people were having increased anxiety and depression and loneliness, but it seemed to be really dependent on how the facilities were managing the pandemic at the time. And so there was definitely some facilities which were overwhelmed with the needs of maintaining hygiene standards and extra cleaning and so forth to keep residents safe, which meant that they found it really difficult to be able to dedicate time to assisting residents to make contact with family. Other facilities were incredibly amazing in terms of the interventions and that they put in place to enable that. And so really what we found is that, yes, those older people living in facilities which were able to provide less support, obviously they found significant increases as anxiety, depression, loneliness, and then of course associated behaviours in dementia such as agitation and so forth. But for some facilities they actually found the older people actually did quite well. And in some cases for dementia, our staff reported that older people actually did better, not having as much contact and disruption that sometimes comes with all of the different visitors that might come into a facility and all the usual activities. So I think, like with community dwelling, it really is a bit of a mixed bag. But more research definitely needs to be done in that space. Yeah, thank you.
All right, the next question is coming from Peter. So Peter wanted to know, is there any research on physical exercise and its impact on mental health during the pandemic?
Okay. Not that I know of in older adults. We do know that physical exercise is associated with better mental health. It is a relatively small effect, but it is a stable effect. We know that physical exercise is particularly good for reducing risk for dementia, and it seems that more vigorous the physical exercise, the better. So my hypothesis would be that yes, those who've been more physically active, probably that was helpful for maintaining mental health in the pandemic, but we don't actually know. So in one of our studies, the study led by Paul Strutt, we didn't actually look at the relationship, and we probably couldn't go back and do that, between physical exercise and mental health, but we did measure changes in physical exercise. And what we found is that older adults, did have to give up a lot of their usual physical activities that they did before, like sports, for instance. But what older people did instead is they adapted. A lot of them took up a lot of gardening, right? And they actually took up a lot of walking. And so, in fact, the overall rates of exercise in the sample that we had didn't change. It was more that it was just a different type of exercise to what they might have been doing before.
All right, so the next question is coming from Nellie. So perhaps that's taking a step back to think about, how will we define poor or low social connection?
Yeah, so partly the definition relates to frequency, and I guess it's really just a normative and average sort of thing. So someone who has low frequency just means they're having a lot less engagement than other people of their age. But usually when we're thinking about the quality, it's really about asking people about how meaningful that social interaction is, how supported they feel by that social interaction, how much they think they benefit, how much they feel that, there's a bit of give and take in those relationships. And so higher quality relationships are ones where people feel like they're appreciated, but there's a bit of give and take. They feel like that they could ask that person for help. Or they feel that person's meeting some kind of need, whether that need is just humour, that person's really good for a laugh, or that person's really good because they're really thoughtful. They're the sorts of things that we know relate to that higher quality of social interaction.
Great. And so the next has a comment coming from Caroline. And so Caroline has observed that some older people perhaps experience difficulties in managing transitions and the stressors of caring, perhaps for another family member. So I wondered if you could maybe make a few comments about in terms of what are some of the sort of possible factors that might make an older person more vulnerable to experiencing, these kind of difficulties in terms of managing these transitions and stressors.
Yeah, so if the question relates to carers, which I think it does, so yeah, there is a large body of evidence that carers typically have higher rates of depression and higher rates of just a sense of burden, I guess, in terms of having to care for the person that they're looking after. And in fact, part of that seems to be just the lack of freedom that comes with being a carer. So carers will often talk about the fact that there's no downtime. You're on 24 hours a day. And often the social interactions of carers becomes quite truncated, because depending on the needs of the person that's being cared for, sometimes social outings become incredibly difficult, whether it's from a physical condition point of view or a mental condition. And so I think carers are a particularly vulnerable group. And in fact, I think there's a real need for more emphasis to go into how we can help carers to manage their mental health. So we did a small study with Parkinson's patients and some of their carers, where we had used telehealth to deliver interventions so that both the carer and the patient could receive strategies for managing anxiety and depression. And we had some, good initial outcomes related to that. So all I can say is that, yes, it's a really important area of need, and just hopefully we'll get to do a study more on that sometime soon.
All right. So I think we have time for 2 more fairly quick questions, and then we'll finish up. So the next question is coming from Peter. So Peter would like to know, is there any sort of ongoing learning or recommendation as a protective factor for aging well and against cognitive decline? Oh, I beg your pardon, that question is actually coming from Donald.
That's okay, that's all right. So the question being, I think, what some of the factors for aging well and reducing cognitive decline. Oh, man, that's a whole other lecture. In a nutshell, in a nutshell, in fact, this actually relates to a study we're just starting right now. In fact, it's an intervention where we are trying to increase routine screening of risks for poor well-being in later life and risks for cognitive decline in later life, and then applying evidence-based interventions for those risks. So we know that the key risks for dementia for an older person are social isolation, physical inactivity, smoking, excessive alcohol use, on the spot, so having a bit of trouble now, hearing loss, depression, air pollution. I think that's about it. But, they're the main ones. And so any of those things work. The biggest ones, though, seem to be depression, social isolation, and smoking. All right. So what we've been talking about today, increasing social participation, is actually something that will reduce risk for dementia. Now, when we think about reducing risk for social isolation, anxiety, and depression, which would be, associated with well-being, very, very similar things in that social participation is actually really important, having those strong connections with other people, maintaining good health, physical activity, right? So it's the same overlapping things. They're common sense things, but I think what we really need to do is just make sure that older people are engaging in these things so they can actually have that sort of long, happy, healthy lifestyle.
Wonderful. And so we have a question coming from Elisa. So speaking of anxiety, so I wonder if you could please define for the audience what anxiety means.
Yeah, sure. So we often, we can talk about anxiety in a colloquial way. I mean, it is an emotion that we all experience. All of us experience anxiety at some point. Typically, it's a worry about some sort of stressful situation that's coming up. And we know, so all the things we've talked about really apply to people who experience more excessive amounts of anxiety, all right? So we can define anxiety as a mental disorder. There are 6 different types of mental disorders which we might see in later life. The 3 most common ones being when someone excessively worries about things. So typically they are worries about their health, other people's health, world affairs, finances. It's just when people sort of get those worries in their head and find them really hard to put them away, to end those worries. And it's often associated with difficulties then with sleeping, for instance, or concentrating, might be headaches and so forth. The other most common types of worry we see in later life is social anxiety. This is when the worries relate to being concerned about what other people think of you, being worried about being judged by people and feeling a little bit nervous about the way you present to others. So maybe social interactions are a little bit more difficult. And the third main type of anxiety we would see in later life are phobias, actually. So having a phobia of heights, having a phobia of falls, having a phobia of lifts, for instance. So I guess the only difference between anxiety disorders and normal levels of anxiety is just the excessiveness of that anxiety, the worry, how excessive it is, and whether or not you're able to control it and put it aside, and whether it impacts on you most days. All right, so the more frequent, the more significant the anxiety.
All right, so I think that's probably all the sort of questions coming from the audience. I guess sort of just to finish up, Viv, have you got any thoughts in terms of, what would be sort of some of the next type of research what we might be looking at, when this pandemic, is over, if there is ever such a time?
Well, there's so many things to do. It's like, what do we do first? I mean, I'm really passionate about increasing access to treatment and access to knowledge, all right? And so because of that, my research really is going to be focused on those things in the next coming years, all right? So helping older people be able to access the treatment, to understand what is anxiety, what is depression, what is loneliness, and how do I do something about those things if I have them or my friend has them, and how do I stop myself from getting those particular conditions as well. And so unfortunately, there isn't a lot of evidence-based practice that happens out in the world when people are trying to look for help for these sorts of problems. And so I'm particularly passionate about being able to increase access to those sorts of interventions. Firstly, it's by developing those interventions and evaluating themselves here at Macquarie University through clinical trials. We've done a number of those. So we have some really good ideas and we have programs that we know work. And now it's then really about extending them out into the broader community so people can easily access these interventions.
All right. So I think that's all the time we have for the Q&A session. So, but finally, I just want to point out we had a lovely comment from Beverly who said, Viv, you have a lovely lilt in your speech, which makes listening much more enjoyable. And I bet you are a really good singer. So I don't know, Viv, are you?
No, I'm not a good singer. And my children never tell me I have a lovely tone of voice, but perhaps I use a different one when I'm talking to you than when I'm talking with my children. Anyway, so as we finish up, I do just want to say thank you again for everyone who continues to support the ageing research agenda we have here at Macquarie in both the Centre for Emotional Health and in the Centre for Ageing, Cognition and Wellbeing. And I particularly appreciate those of you who do our research projects. I know you do many surveys many times, but it is really appreciated and really helpful. So thank you again.
All right. And so finally, I do want to give special thanks to Nicole McNeese and Beck Seiler for their help with organising this event, as Viv mentioned earlier. And of course, thanks, Viv, for taking the time to share your research and findings of your research with our members of the community. So thank you, everyone, again, for your time. Thank you for taking the time to join us. And so enjoy your long weekend, stay safe, and good evening.